We have all encountered them. The hypercritical colleague who spots a typo in your slide deck and announces it to the entire email thread, the toxic rival who subtly undermines your ideas during a presentation, or the relentless online contrarian who cherry picks your work just to find a flaw. Hmm? Our biological wiring tells us to fire back. When someone attacks our work or our status, our amygdala, the brain's emotional threat center, instantly lights up. We want to defend our territory, expose their bias, or strike back with a sharper insult. But when you engage a critic on a battlefield of hostility, you enter a losing game. Again, directly fighting a critic creates a dangerous psychological trap known as the backfire effect. When you argue against a critic's objections, their brain doesn't pause to reconsider your perspective. Instead, it treats your defense as a direct threat to its own ego. They will dig their heels in, look for even more flaws to justify their original stance, and turn a simple difference of opinion into a long term, toxic war of attrition. And Dale Carnegie decoded the flaw in this approach over a century ago. You cannot win an argument by fighting it. If you lose the argument, you lose. If you win the argument and completely crush the critic's point, you still lose because you have deeply wounded their pride. A person convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. To completely neutralize a determined critic, you have to bypass their emotional defenses entirely. You do this by deploying a highly sophisticated psychological maneuver, the third person compliment. Instead of treating their criticism as an act of war, you treat it as a sign of their elite standards. By using a precise framing technique, you praise the very eye that found your flaw. In doing so, you pull them out of their adversarial role and drop them directly into a collaborative trap where continuing to attack you would actively destroy their own newly elevated reputation. Kicking. Fighting a critic only forces them to double down to protect their ego. The third person compliment neutralizes them by praising their high standards instead of fighting their points here. To understand why this strategy works, you have to look closely at the underlying pathology of a persistent critic. Most people assume critics attack out of pure malice or a dislike of your personality. In reality, criticism is almost always a frantic quest for significance. The critic uses their sharp eye to spot flaws because it makes them feel superior, intelligent, and deeply necessary to the room. When you fight their feedback, you threaten that source of significance, forcing them to become even more hostile. To protect it, the third person compliment completely flips this dynamic by satisfying their hunger for significance up front. Instead of fighting the criticism, you validate the intellect behind the criticism. Yes. You don't say, "You're right and I'm wrong." That is submission, which kills your authority. Instead, you say, "I appreciate how incredibly detail oriented you are." This is calibration. You take their aggressive energy and reframe it as a high value character trait. Adversarial framing. You are attacking my work to make me look bad. Collaborative framing. You have exceptionally high standards, which makes our project better. Look at how this tactical shift changes the psychological landscape. The amateur response. You're completely misinterpreting the data. We looked at those metrics last month, and your point doesn't apply here. The critic's ego is threatened. The war begins. The master response. One of the things I always value about having Sarah in these reviews is her absolute refusal to let lazy data slide. She has a sharp eye for hidden metrics, and it forces all of us to elevate our game. Look at the trap you have just set. By praising Sarah's high standards to a third party or the rest of the room, you have wrapped her in a golden straitjacket of prestige. If she continues to aggressively attack your presentation, she will look petty, mean spirited, and entirely inconsistent with the high standard professional identity you just handed her. Her own ego will now force her to moderate her tone, soften her critiques, and actively protect the very project she was trying to tear down. Praising a critic's high standards wraps them in a golden straitjacket of prestige. To keep attacking you, they would have to destroy their own reputation. Delian, the magic of the third person compliment isn't just in what you say, it is in the strategic distance you create. If you look a critic in the eye and overpraise them to their face, it can often come across as patronizing or sarcastic, which will only infuriate them further. To execute this surgically, you must utilize the triangulation effect. You don't aim the compliment at the critic, you aim it at the room while the critic is listening, or you aim it at a third party who is likely to relay the positive sentiment back to them. By making them a subject of your admiration rather than a target of your defense, you remove the threat and replace it with a social obligation. EI, identify the critic's signature weapon, e.g., sharp eye, brutal honesty, technical rigor. R. Publicly acknowledge that specific trait as a massive asset to the team. San. Pivot back to your work, framing it as the challenge that helps them shine. Okay, here is exactly how you handle a critic who just tried to undermine you in a meeting. Like the moment you are presenting a growth strategy and your rival, Mark, jumps in to pick apart your logic in front of the VP. Okay? The pivot, instead of defending your logic, you stop, you look at the VP and say, um, Mark is always the first person in the room to pressure test our assumptions. That's exactly why he's so valuable for these high stakes reviews. Mark, keep that focus coming. Let's look at the risk assessment you're flagging. In that single calm motion, you have done three things. E, neutralize the attack. You didn't defend yourself. You moved the conversation to pressure testing assumptions, which sounds much more professional than picking apart my logic. Arvot authenticated the critic. By labeling him as valuable, you satisfy his ego's need for importance. San, harness the energy, you turned him from an adversary into an unpaid consultant. Now, he feels a social pressure to actually help you solve the problem rather than just tearing it down. Like, when you refuse to treat a critic as an enemy, they lose their most powerful weapon, your defensiveness. You take away the very game they were trying to play, and you force them to pivot to a game where you are the one holding all the cards. Like, the third person compliment works because it turns an adversary into an unpaid consultant, forcing them to live up to the high status label you just assigned them. No, once the third person compliment lands, a fascinating psychological transformation occurs within the critic's mind. They enter a state of forced alignment. In behavioral science, this is closely tied to the law of reciprocity. When you gift someone an elevated status in front of their peers, their subconscious feels a powerful obligation to repay you with fairness, or at the very least, a truth. Okay? You have essentially established a silent treaty. Okay? By refusing to fight them, you deny them the dopamine hit of a public argument. More importantly, you alter how the rest of the room views the dynamic. When a critic attacks and you fire back defensively, the audience sees a squabble between two equals fighting for dominance. But when a critic attacks and you calmly reframe their hostility as a valuable asset to the project, the audience sees a high status leader orchestrating the room. Anxious response, argue the details. You look defensive, critic looks powerful. High status response, praise the eye. You look like the conductor. Critic looks like your orchestra. From that moment on, the critic's leverage evaporates. If they continue to nitpick your work with aggressive malice, they face a severe social penalty. The room will no longer see them as a sharp, objective analyst. They will see them as an ungrateful contrarian trying to tear down the very person who publicly championed their intellect. They, the critic quickly realizes that the only way to keep the prestige you gave them is to play by your rules. They stop looking for ways to make you fail and start looking for ways to help the project succeed because their own pride is now permanently tied to the standard you set. Okay. When you reframe a critic's hostility as an asset, the room stops seeing a fight and starts seeing a leader orchestrating the energy of the room. Jalian, when you master this level of psychological sophistication, your entire perspective on professional friction undergoes a profound shift. You stop viewing critics as toxic hurdles to be avoided or enemies to be destroyed. Instead, you begin to see them as raw energy, a powerful stream of focused, analytical attention that simply needs to be captured and redirected. You realize that the ultimate measure of your authority is not how many arguments you can win, but how cleanly you can dissolve the conflict entirely. Okay. This is the brilliant, enduring heart of Dale Carnegie's philosophy. He didn't want us to master human engineering so we could trick people or win cheap points in meetings. He taught us that when you actively choose to quiet your own defensive ego, step past the insult, and speak directly to a critic's desire for importance, you are executing the highest form of emotional maturity. In a corporate landscape where everyone is desperately fighting to prove they're right, your ability to turn an attack into an asset makes you an exceptionally rare and magnetic force. The rule of the golden straitjacket: never fight a critic on the terms of their attack. Give them an elevated identity based on their sharp eye, and watch their own ego force them to protect you simply because they cannot afford to lose the prestige you just handed them. Okay. By utilizing the triangulation technique, reframing hostility as a commitment to excellence, and setting the trap of forced alignment, you achieve something magnificent. You take complete control of the social field without ever raising your voice. The people around you will notice that critics seem to mysteriously soften their stance the moment they enter your orbit. They will see that you don't get triggered, you don't get defensive, and you don't get pulled into the mud. Hmm? Hank? As you carry this cinematic blueprint back into the high stakes, competitive arenas of your career, remember the quiet rules of the game. Let the insecure professionals bicker over details. Let the average managers exhaust themselves in corporate wars, and let the loud voices fight for the last word while they are busy destroying their relationships. In the spotlight, you will build an untouchable network of alignment from the shadows. By mastering the art of the third person compliment, you gain the ultimate silent leverage, the unshakable power to turn your harshest critics into your most reliable protectors, simply because you were smart enough to let their pride work for you. And by mastering the third person compliment, you gain the ultimate silent leverage, the power to turn your harshest critics into your most reliable protectors. Lalian,